Margaret Alderton Cress held the ledger open on her lap and read the line a third time. E. Alderton, admitted the 4th of September, 1931. Discharged the 12th of January, 1938. She was sitting on an overturned crate in the carriage house at Alderton House, on River Road in Iberville Parish, where she had come 6 days earlier to begin clearing her late father's estate. She was 68 years old, a retired head librarian who had spent 41 years with the West Baton Rouge Parish Library System before her retirement in 2019, and she had been told by her father, by her aunt, and by a Parish Historical Society newsletter published in 1987 that every surviving record of the Alderton family sanitarium had been destroyed in a fire in the West Records Room on the night of the 6th of November, 1943. She had found the ledger inside a locked strongbox behind a false panel in the carriage house wall, a panel she had only found because the wallpaper behind it did not match the water staining on either side of it. E. Alderton was her grandmother. Her grandmother's obituary, printed in the Plaquemine Post on the 9th of March, 1934, said she had died peacefully at home of natural causes, surrounded by family. The ledger said she was still a patient 4 years after that. What the discrepancy meant, and where a woman the public record insisted was dead, had actually been between 1934 and whatever became of her after a discharge date no other document would ever explain, was not something Margaret Alderton Cress expected to spend the better part of a year finding out. She had come to the carriage house to sort furniture for an estate sale. She left it holding a bound ledger with a cracked leather spine and a strong box key still warm from her own hand. The specific question she carried out of that carriage house, the one she would not be able to answer for another 5 months, was simple enough to say aloud to herself in the empty room. If Eleanor Alderton died in 1934, who was admitted, treated, and discharged under her name for the 4 years after that? And why does the sanitarium's own paperwork agree that it happened? The family's account of the 1943 fire was specific and, on its face, entirely credible. Whitmore Alderton, Cornelius Alderton's son and by then the sanitarium's sole administrator, filed an insurance claim with the Louisiana Mutual Assurance Company dated the 11th of November, 1943, 5 days after the blaze, stating that a faulty flue in the West Records Room had ignited stored paper and destroyed the entirety of the facility's administrative archive dating back to its founding in 1911. The claim was paid in full the following February. Curtis Boudreau, the Iberville Parish archivist who has managed the courthouse's historical collections for 26 years, told Margaret when she first brought him the ledger that the fire account had never been disputed by anyone, in any record he had seen, in the 81 years since. It was, he said, simply what had happened, and he had catalogued it that way himself in the parish's own historical index. It was a reasonable explanation, delivered by a credible source, and for 11 days, Margaret accepted it. Then she went back to the ledger's inside cover and read, a second time, the small ink accession stamp she had noted but not yet followed up on. Removed for family review, W.A., October 30th, 1943. 7 days before the fire that supposedly destroyed it. A ledger cannot be both consumed by a blaze on the 6th of November and checked out for family review on the 30th of October, unless someone returned it afterward to a building that no longer had a records room to return it to. Margaret brought the stamp back to Curtis Boudreau and asked him to explain it. He looked at the photograph on her phone for close to a minute. He told her he would need to pull the original insurance file again and get back to her. That was 4 months ago. He has not returned her calls since the second week of that inquiry, and the parish office's automated voicemail system now routes her directly to a general archives mailbox that no one appears to check. The Alderton family sanitarium was built in 1911 on 80 acres of former sugarcane land along the Mississippi River, land that had belonged to the Alderton family since 1847 and had grown less profitable each decade after the Civil War, as the family's fortune, like many along that stretch of the river, shifted from cane to something less visible. The 1847 land grant, recorded in the Iberville Parish Courthouse and still legible on its original vellum, describes the boundary of the property by reference to a since-vanished bend in the river channel, which shifted more than 400 yards to the east by 1902, according to the Army Corps of Engineers' own survey of that year. Meaning the eastern 40 acres of the modern parcel, the same acreage that would later hold the quicklime deliveries, technically sat under river water for at least part of the 19th century, a detail no family document ever mentions, and that Margaret found only by overlaying 2 survey maps a century and a half apart on her own dining room table, using a magnifying sheet she ordered specifically for the purpose after her reading glasses proved insufficient. Dr. Cornelius Alderton, trained in Philadelphia and returned to Louisiana in 1908, converted the family's plantation house and a new wing built specifically for the purpose into a private psychiatric facility, catering to what the sanitarium's own promotional pamphlet, printed in 1913 and preserved today in the Louisiana State Archives, called Families of Position Throughout the Gulf South Requiring the Utmost Discretion. It was, by design, a place where wealthy families sent relatives whose presence had become, for one reason or another, inconvenient, and where, for a fee scaled to the family's means, that inconvenience could be managed quietly, indefinitely, and without public record. In its first decade, the sanitarium held, by its own annual reports, no more than 12 to 15 patients at any time. And the surviving photographs from that period show a well-tended lawn, a croquet court laid out on the east side of the main house, and a visiting day held on the first Sunday of every month, attended, according to a 1917 guest book, by an average of 9 family parties. It was, on paper, an unremarkable private hospital. Cornelius Alderton died in 1927, and the sanitarium passed to his son Whitmore, then 34, who had trained under his father for 6 years but never completed a formal medical residency of his own, a fact noted without further comment in a 1928 letter of reference the family solicited from a Baton Rouge physician on Whitmore's behalf. Under Whitmore's administration, the facility's own annual patient counts, filed voluntarily with the state each year through 1937 and preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, show a pattern that a casual reader would take for ordinary institutional growth. 11 patients in 1927, 17 by 1930, 26 by 1934, holding roughly steady in the high 20s through the remainder of the decade. What the annual counts do not show, because they were never designed to, is churn. How many of those 26 in any given year were the same 26 as the year before, and how many had been replaced, on paper, by someone else's name attached to a case number that predated them. The sanitarium operated for 48 years, closing in 1959, after the State Medical Board revoked its operating license following an inspection that cited, among 6 violations, inadequate staffing records and an admissions ledger system the inspector's report described only as irregular. The report itself, filed with the Louisiana Department of Hospitals, runs to 11 pages. Page 7, which the report's table of contents describes as containing specific patient case irregularities noted during inspection, is missing from the copy held by the State Archive. It has been missing, according to a note in the file's metadata, since at least 1971. The first thing that did not fit, beyond Eleanor's discharge date itself, was small, and Margaret almost missed it. The ledger recorded 91 admissions between 1911 and 1943, each with a name, an admission date, and in the far right column, a resolution: discharged, transferred, or deceased. Of the 91, 14 carried a discharge date that Margaret was able to cross-reference against a public obituary for the same individual, printed by a family that believed, apparently, that the person in question had already died. In 11 of the 14 cases, years before the ledger's discharge date. Eleanor Alderton was not an anomaly. She was one entry in a pattern that ran the length of the ledger, in the same hand, in the same ink, across 3 decades. By the time Margaret had confirmed the fourth of these 14 cases, a Baton Rouge banker's wife, publicly buried in 1926, discharged from the Alderton Sanitarium, according to the ledger, in 1931. The story had stopped being about her grandmother specifically, and had become a story about a facility that had, for reasons the surviving paperwork did not explain, systematically extended the institutional lives of patients whose families had already publicly and permanently buried them. The pattern did not stay inside a single decade. A fifth case, cross-referenced against the Natchez family's 1919 funeral notice, showed the same gap. A public death followed by a private admission, followed years later by a ledger discharge no obituary would ever record. A sixth, from 1941, showed the identical structure playing out on the eve of the sanitarium's own closing decade, as though whatever the practice was, it had not been an early irregularity the family later corrected, but a standing procedure maintained, without interruption, from the facility's second full year of operation until within 2 years of its final inspection. Margaret found Dr. Priscilla Hanratty through a referral from the State Archive itself, which keeps a short list of independent examiners it recommends for family document disputes, precisely because it declines, as a matter of policy, to authenticate materials that did not come through its own accession process. Dr. Hanratty had spent 19 years with the Louisiana State Police Crime Laboratory before retiring into private consulting work in 2021, most of it on questions document cases for criminal trials rather than family history. She met Margaret for the first time on the 3rd of April at a coffee shop in Baton Rouge, rather than her own office, and examined the ledger for 11 minutes at the table before agreeing to take the case, photographing the binding and 3 sample pages on her phone before she would say anything further. A forensic document examiner with the Louisiana State Police Crime Laboratory, whom Margaret retained privately, she confirmed within 9 days that the ledger's binding, paper stock, and ink were consistent with continuous use across the full period the entries claimed, 1911 to 1943, and that no pages had been added, removed, or rebound at any point in the volume's history. The entries were not forgeries. They were, Dr. Hanratty told her over the phone on the 22nd of April, an authentic and contemporaneous record of something the sanitarium's administrators had never intended anyone outside the family to see. She agreed to examine the 14 discrepant entries in detail and provide a written comparison against the public obituaries Margaret had gathered. Her report, delivered by mail 6 weeks later, ran to 2 paragraphs. It confirmed the handwriting on all 14 entries belonged to Whitmore Alderton. It offered no further analysis. Dr. Hanratty's cover note said only that she considered her contracted work complete and did not feel she was the appropriate person to draw further conclusions from the material. She did not return Margaret's follow-up call. Her office, when Margaret phoned a second time in June, said she had taken an extended leave from casework and could not say when she would return. It is worth saying once, and then letting it sit. 3 miles from the Alderton property on the other side of Bayou Plaquemine, a much smaller private nursing facility run by the Trosclair family closed abruptly in 1939, and its own admissions ledger, according to a single line in an unrelated 1940 tax assessment, was likewise destroyed by fire before inventory could be completed. No further record of the Trosclair facility, or of what happened to its patients, survives anywhere in Iberville Parish. It is worth setting down briefly and then setting aside. Among the papers in the same strongbox as the ledger, wrapped separately in oilcloth, Margaret found a stack of receipts from a Baton Rouge lime supplier, dated at regular monthly intervals from March of 1931 to October of 1943. Each for 400 pounds of quicklime, billed to the Alderton estate rather than the sanitarium itself, and delivered not to the main facility but to an adjacent 40-acre parcel that Whitmore Alderton sold to the city of Plaquemine in 1943, the same year as the fire, for what the deed of sale describes as road expansion purposes. No road was ever built on that parcel. It remains, according to the current Iberville Parish tax rolls, an undeveloped lot owned by the city, assessed at agricultural value, and used for nothing. Quicklime, in the quantities and at the interval the receipts describe, has one well-documented 19th and early 20th century use outside agriculture, to accelerate the breakdown of organic remains and suppress the smell of decomposition, a use so standard by 1931 that the supplier's own invoice, printed rather than handwritten, carried a line for purpose that Whitmore Alderton, in every one of the 149 surviving receipts, left blank. The supplier itself, a firm called Ory Brothers Lime and Building Supply, operated out of Baton Rouge from 1908 until it was dissolved in 1951, and its own surviving delivery logs, held today by a descendant of the founding family who agreed to let Margaret photograph 3 pages in his garage in July, list the Alderton account under a customer code rather than a name, a practice the logs show was reserved in that period for fewer than a dozen of the firm's several hundred regular customers. The 1943 plat map filed with the sale of that same parcel shows the 40 acres as a single unmarked rectangle, with no notation, no structure, no easement, and no drainage feature indicated anywhere within its boundary. A blankness that stands out only because every other parcel on the same plat sheet, filed by the same surveyor in the same month, carries at least one such notation. A field that had been in continuous agricultural use for 4 decades, according to the family's own tax filings, should have shown irrigation ditches, fence lines, something. This one showed nothing at all, as though the surveyor had drawn its outline and then declined, deliberately, to look inside it. Whitmore Alderton's personal correspondence, held in a separate collection donated to the Louisiana State Archives by a cousin in 1988, includes 11 letters to his sister, dated between 1934 and 1943, discussing sanitarium business in general terms, staffing, supply costs, occasional mentions of patients by first initial only. The 12th letter in the folder, dated the 2nd of November 1943, 4 days before the fire, stops mid-sentence at the bottom of its first page. The situation with E has become impossible to manage discreetly, and I have concluded that the only remaining course is to... And there the page ends. The second page of the letter is not in the folder. The archive's finding aid lists the letter as 2 pages. Only one has ever been located. The archivist who processed the donation in 1988, a woman named Cordelia Pruitt, who has since died, noted in her own processing log, preserved with the collection, that the folder arrived already incomplete, and that she had made no attempt to locate the missing page, as it was, in her words, not the archive's place to reconstruct a family's private correspondence. The cousin who donated the collection in 1988, a great-niece of Whitmore's named Josephine Alderton Cade, is herself deceased. But her son, Margaret's second cousin, a retired oil field engineer living in Lake Charles, agreed to meet Margaret in July after she explained what she had found. He told her that his mother had spoken exactly once in the last year of her life about a box of family papers she had deliberately not donated along with the rest, and that she had told him only that the box belonged to the field, not the house, and that he was to burn it if he ever found it after her death, without opening it first. He told Margaret he never found the box. He said this sitting across from her at his own kitchen table, turning a coffee cup slowly in both hands, and then asked whether she thought his mother had been telling the truth about not knowing where it was. Margaret told him she did not know. Neither of them has raised the subject again in the 2 calls they have had since. The State Medical Board's 1959 inspection file, the same file missing its 7th page, does survive in one other form, a carbon copy retained by the inspector himself, a man named Aubrey Delacroix, whose personal papers were donated to Louisiana State University's special collections by his estate in 1994. The carbon copy is complete. Page 7 describes, in the inspector's own clinical language, a pattern across multiple admission files in which patients recorded as deceased by external sources continue to appear in active census counts for periods ranging from 2 to 7 years thereafter, and recommends the matter be referred to the parish coroner's office for further review. No referral to the coroner's office appears in any surviving Iberville Parish record from 1959 or any year following. The coroner's office at that time was held by a physician who was, Margaret confirmed only through a marriage record filed in the parish clerk's office in the spring of 1951, Aubrey Delacroix's own brother-in-law, a relationship the inspection file does not disclose anywhere in its 11 pages. Margaret wrote to the coroner's surviving grandson, a retired pharmacist now living in Lafayette, in June, asking whether any family papers survived from his grandfather's time in the office. He wrote back once, a single paragraph, saying that his grandfather had destroyed most of his professional papers before his death in 1968, at his own instruction, in his own presence, and that the family had never questioned why. He did not answer Margaret's second letter, sent 5 weeks later with a copy of the Delacroix inspection page enclosed, and a certified mail receipt confirms it was delivered to his address on the 9th of July. Curtis Boudreau, for his part, has not entirely vanished from the record of this investigation, even if he has stopped answering Margaret directly. In August, a records clerk in his office, a young woman named Denise Accord, 2 years into the job and not yet fully briefed on which files were, by long custom, better left alone, confirmed to Margaret's attorney in a brief phone call the attorney later summarized in an email that the original 1943 insurance file Curtis Boudreau had promised to re-pull did exist, had been checked out of the parish archive in May under Curtis Boudreau's own name, and had not yet been returned. The clerk could not say when it would be. She said this was not unusual for Curtis Boudreau, who had a habit of keeping files out for months at a time, and that no one in the office had thought to press him about it before Margaret's attorney called. Denise Accord offered, unprompted, to look for the file herself in Curtis Boudreau's own office the following week, since he was scheduled to be out on leave. She did not call back that week, or the one after. When Margaret's attorney followed up in September, the office's receptionist told him Denise Accord no longer worked there, and could not say, or would not say, whether she had left voluntarily. It was somewhere in the middle of this, cross-referencing the 1959 inspection against a similar, much smaller complaint filed against a private sanitarium in East Baton Rouge Parish in 1937, that Margaret found a single paragraph in an unrelated state health department bulletin, noting that a facility identified only as a private institution in Iberville Parish had been the subject of an informal 1922 inquiry into record-keeping practices inconsistent with patient welfare, an inquiry that appears to have been closed without further action, and that names no facility, no administrator, and no outcome. Whether this refers to the Alderton Sanitarium at all cannot be confirmed from the surviving bulletin, which gives no case number and no cross-reference to any other file. It is mentioned once, in a single sentence of a 90-page annual report, and it is not mentioned again in any subsequent year's bulletin. Margaret has not been able to locate the underlying case file, if one still exists, and the State Health Department's current records office has told her in writing that any file from that period would have been transferred to the State Archive decades ago, a transfer the State Archive has no record of receiving. She submitted a formal public records request for any surviving 1922 correspondence between the State Health Department and Iberville Parish on the 9th of June. The request was acknowledged within the statutory 10-day window, assigned a case number, and then, according to the portal Margaret has checked every week since, has remained in a status the department's own system labels under departmental review for 104 days without further update. She called the department's public records liaison twice in August. Both calls were returned by an assistant rather than the liaison herself, and both times the assistant told her the same thing, that the file was still being located, that these things sometimes take time with older records, and that someone would be in touch as soon as there was an update. No one has been in touch since the 2nd of September. The pattern does not end with the sanitarium's 1959 closure. In 2006, when the State Historical Trust conducted a routine structural assessment of Alderton House ahead of a proposed public tour program that was ultimately never funded, The contracted engineer noted in a section of his report Margaret only located this year by requesting the trust's complete file rather than its public summary, that the carriage house foundation showed evidence of prior excavation inconsistent with any structure indicated on record drawings, a finding the 2006 report does not develop further, and that the trust's public summary omits entirely. The engineer who wrote that report retired the following year and could not be reached for this investigation. The trust's current director, when Margaret asked in September why the finding had never been mentioned to the family, said only that the 2006 assessment had been administrative in nature, and that she was not in a position to speculate about a predecessor's internal notes. Dr. Sandra Okafor, a geophysicist Margaret hired in August to survey the 40-acre parcel using ground-penetrating radar, spent 2 days walking the property in a grid pattern before she found what she described, in a brief phone call rather than the full written report her contract specified, as a series of anomalies consistent with excavated and refilled ground, arranged in rows, across roughly 6 of the 40 acres. The rows, when Dr. Okafor read off their spacing to Margaret over the phone before she stopped elaborating, ran at intervals of 6 feet, a spacing that matched nothing in any agricultural use the parcel's tax history recorded. She told Margaret she would need a state archaeologist's authorization before doing any further work, since the anomalies could constitute unmarked graves under Louisiana law, and that she was not in a position to proceed without it. She submitted her preliminary data to the state archaeologist's office on the 14th of August. As of this recording, no state archaeologist has been assigned to the case, and Dr. Okafor's firm has since informed Margaret, through an assistant rather than Dr. Okafor herself, that the firm's insurance carrier has advised against further involvement pending the outcome of unrelated internal review. Margaret drove out to the 40-acre parcel herself once in September, on a Tuesday afternoon with no particular reason for choosing that day, beyond the fact that her calendar happened to be empty, and stood at its edge for 11 minutes without crossing the fence line. She had the radar survey data in a folder on the seat of her car, and her attorney had told her twice by that point that she likely had standing, as a direct descendant of a documented patient, to petition for a court-ordered excavation. She did not cross the fence. She got back into the car, drove home, and did not call her attorney that week, or the following one. When he called her instead, she let it go to voicemail, and has not, as of this recording, returned that call or the 2 that followed it. She has told no one, including the reporter who later interviewed Ambrose Fontenot, precisely why she stopped at the fence line rather than past it, and the investigation, on this point, does not go any further than she has been willing to take it. Alderton House itself, the main structure where Margaret's father lived until his death 8 months ago, and where Margaret has spent most evenings since, standing in rooms she remembers from childhood visits that now feel considerably smaller than they did then, sold to the State Historical Trust in 1976 for a token sum, and leased back to the family for the remainder of Cornelius's direct descendants' lifetimes, a clause that will expire, according to the original 1976 agreement, upon Margaret's own death, at which point the house and its surrounding 12 acres, though not the 40-acre parcel across the road, which was never part of the trust agreement, will pass to the state. The carriage house where Margaret found the ledger is not included in the Historical Trust's inventory of the property's structures at all. It does not appear on the Trust's 1976 survey, though it appears unmistakably in every aerial photograph of the property taken since 1953. The parcel is still there. It sits between 2 soybean fields on the east side of River Road, unmarked, ungrazed, its boundary fence sagging in 3 places where deer have pushed through it for years without anyone repairing the gap. Ambrose Fontenot is 94 years old and has lived on River Road since 1938, in a house his father built 200 yards from the Alderton property line. He worked as a groundskeeper for the Alderton family from 1951 until the sanitarium closed in 1959, and continued doing occasional yard work for the family privately for another decade after that, mowing the 12 acres around the main house on a schedule his own daughter, now 61, still remembers from childhood as every second Thursday. He was 17 when Whitmore Alderton hired him, the youngest of 5 brothers from a sharecropping family 2 farms down the road. And by his own account to the Baton Rouge Advocate, he never once, in 8 years of employment, saw the interior of the sanitarium's records room, was never asked to work near the carriage house, and was paid for the entirety of his employment in cash rather than by check, a detail the reporter noted but did not pursue further. When the reporter, following up on Margaret's public records request, asked him whether he remembered anything unusual about the 40-acre parcel during his years working the property, he said that Mr. Whitmore had told him, his first week on the job, that the east field was not part of his responsibilities, and he was not to walk it, mow it, or ask about it, and that he had done exactly as he was told for 8 years, without once setting foot past the fence line. He said this once, sitting on his porch, and then asked the reporter to leave. The ledger is still on Margaret's dining room table on the evenings she chooses to look at it. She has read the same 14 entries so many times that she no longer needs to open the book to recite the dates. Late in October, going back through it a final time before deciding whether to donate it to the state archive or keep it in the family, she noticed in the margin beside her grandmother's entry a single small mark she had passed over 11 times before. A cross, no more than a 1/4 inch, made not in the black fountain pen ink used for the rest of the entry, but in pencil, faint enough that it is visible only when the page is held at an angle to strong light. It does not appear beside any of the other 13 discrepant entries. It appears nowhere else in the ledger's 91 pages. Among the receipts in the same strongbox, folded inside an envelope from a New Orleans photography studio that has no other connection to anything else in the family's papers, is a single print showing 6 unidentified women standing in a row in front of a building that does not match any known photograph of the Alderton house or its wings, undated, unlabeled, and addressed on the back in a hand that does not match Whitmore Alderton's, to a name Margaret has not been able to trace to any Alderton